Tonight, Kevin Dwarka and his associate Robert Joseph will be presenting to the board a policy framework with strategies for housing in the village. In the framework, Mr. Dwarka has delineated both the pros and cons of each policy and essentially created a menu of options that the village must weigh to determine which are most appropriate and right for its implementation. As you will recall, we commenced this comprehensive housing study with a three-step process with public listening and stakeholder sessions on March 6th and an additional one added on April 23rd. Mr. Dwarka and his staff analyzed census data to better understand the demographic and socioeconomic composition of the village. Past plans and studies were reviewed, a cross-section of stakeholders were interviewed, and Mr. Dwarka and his staff toured the village in order to better assess the current housing conditions in the village. Mr. Dwarka appeared before this board on March 22nd and presented a draft existing conditions assessment. Once the data was analyzed, the consultant and his team looked at identifying and determining the village's housing needs. All of this data helped inform the final step, which is the definition of a policy framework. Last week, on June 8th, we had two public presentations of the policy recommendations at the community center, and public input was sought. Tonight, Mr. Dwarka will provide a detailed presentation of his policy framework to the board, and we look forward to your comments and questions in order to better refine the proposed policies and strategies so that the policies that are implemented help the village move closer to addressing its goals for safe, affordable, and accessible housing. In order to allow for public comment, for the next 2 weeks, the slides presented tonight will be available on the village website, along with the Mr. Dwarka's YouTube presentation of the slides.
Okay, trustees, can everyone hear me? Okay, good. Trustees, thanks for having me this evening to give you an update on the housing study that we've been working away at for the past several months. And I want to begin by going backwards in time a little bit. Before I was engaged by the village, there was a debate unfolding over several months and continuing into the summer in 2016 about whether or not the village of Ossining should invoke its abilities to adopt rent stabilization under the state's Emergency Tenant Protection Act. And it was a debate that was, I think, very polarizing in many ways, with a lot of views on either side. And certainly, as part of this study, it is our job to navigate the pros and cons associated with rent stabilization and to ground that evaluation in the experience of other communities, in best practices, in the returns on the policy in terms of benefits, but also in terms of its fiscal implications. But what I want to emphasize is that regardless of what direction this community goes down with respect to rent stabilization, a spectrum of different policy approaches has to be considered as part of the village's pathway forward to dealing with its housing needs. Even if the village adopts rent stabilization, there are still a number of housing issues in this community that are not addressed by rent stabilization and merit consideration of other policies, right? And so, and if you don't adopt rent stabilization, then there needs to be consideration of how to redress some of the issues that many have voiced in their embrace of rent stabilization through other mechanisms. So I say all of this because I know that, from my engagement in this community and conversations, that ETPA rises very much to the top, and perhaps with good reason, as we'll get into later into this presentation, in terms of a policy issue meriting discussion. But we consciously chose to ground the consideration of ETPA in a spectrum of housing needs, in a spectrum of different strategies that could be provided within a broader toolkit, and to look at this issue holistically, as opposed to in isolation. So let me start by just summarizing what we've learned in our time here in Ossining with regards to the major housing needs. And I'm not going to go into tremendous statistical detail here because I did so during a previous presentation before the village board, and it's online and available, where I bombarded them with a lot of statistics, as you may recall. But to summarize, to recap, in terms of the economic side here, what we know is that there are rising rents in Ossining, as there are throughout the New York metro region, and also rising housing costs, and that it is difficult for households in Ossining to afford the rent, to afford the cost of their homes, and not only because of the cost of mortgage if it's an owner-occupied home, but also because of the burden associated with property taxes, a burden that is made more extreme by the village's dependency on residential property tax and the relative smallness amount of commercial tax. And that this situation of cost burden, while it is one that is felt throughout the region, is certainly one that your community consistently and broadly voices as a key concern. The secondary issue relates to the conditions of the building stock here. And if there's one complaint that seems to rise above the rest, it is the overcrowding of your buildings, especially some of your smaller 2 or 3 family units, where indications are presented by mailboxes outside, or anecdotes, or the number of cars parked in front of a building, suggest that the buildings are tenanted way beyond what they should be given local and state regulations. And that this concern about overcrowding points more fundamentally to a value that the housing in Ossining should be more than simply okay. It should be high quality, that we shouldn't have a community that has substandard housing, and that inasmuch as we try in this village to redress the code violations and the overcrowding issues through the activities of the building department and through the judicial process, that we still fall short of really living up to the standard of housing and habitability that we would like to see. A third issue relates to the supply of housing within the locality and the way in which your current policy instruments, namely your comprehensive plan, your zoning code, your affordable housing policy, work together in order to facilitate the development of new housing at all price points, and whether or not these policy statements, though well-meaning in all of them and effective on many levels, are fully doing their job in terms of enabling the types of housing units that could be built in Ossining that meet the needs of your current and future residents, if the policy statements are truly supporting in reality the flow of those types of units into the village. Then there is the whole development of affordable housing, and tremendous work is happening in this community through groups like IFCA, some affordable housing developers, presence here of the housing financial entity CPC. But there is a question as to whether or not these groups, entities, individuals are enough in terms of institutional capacity to deliver the type of housing, to be able to channel the resources available, to qualify for the types of fund financing that is available. And then lastly, in terms of housing needs, is the question of gentrification, displacement. These are words often discussed, but yet very difficult to measure. What we know is, at least on a perceptual level, the reaction to rising costs of living is compelling many people to worry that Ossining may not be a place where they can raise their children, where they can age in place, and that, as new housing has come into the pipeline, priced at levels beyond what they're able to afford, that the effects of this new housing may also have implications on the rental costs and on the home values in surrounding areas, and therefore make the housing market here even more difficult with regards to affordability. So that is a quick recap of the major currents that unfolded from my firm's quantitative analysis, from our outreach, from our conversations with the community, facilitated roundtable discussions, public workshops, listening sessions. All of those things were the issues that came forth. And based on all of that information, we then began a process to look at what might be potential solutions and strategies as have been explored in other communities, and what might be the implications should they be applied in Ossining. Let me emphasize, we did not embrace any particular strategy. We looked at the strategies in relationship to the matters which you see on the screen before, which are the housing needs. And we evaluated what the pros and cons would be of these strategies, and did so in a completely non-ideological approach. I know there's many advocates for some of these strategies. I know there's many opponents. And what we've tried to do is be as comprehensive as we can in making sure that we're covering each strategy from all sides, fighting with ourselves and trying to figure out what might be the advantage and what might be the limitation of each one. And so I am going to go through them, and I want everyone to know who's listening that this presentation is also going to be made available online. And just as we had a public workshop last week that allowed residents to evaluate the level of prioritization of the strategies, the online version of this presentation will also allow it. These slides will be posted. On YouTube will be this presentation, which is being recorded. And in addition to being able to prioritize the strategies that I'm going to go through, there will also be room for written comment, so that anyone who would like to provide a more elaborate response, we do so. And then as my team continues to develop and evaluate these strategies, we will import the public comment, and we will include that in our own document, and we will address the issues that come up and try and disentangle, with regard to the comments, what we know, what we don't know, what's speculative, what needs more research, and embed that into the document. So with that, let me now move in to our first strategy, which relates to code enforcement. And I'm aware that for some, code enforcement may not represent the most important strategy if housing affordability is one of the issues that is placed up there as being one of the most important things to address. But I would argue that an effective code enforcement system is in fact really important to the overall affordable housing strategy. The violation of building codes due to overcrowding creates distortions with regard to the valuation of certain buildings here, whereby because the rent rolls are inflated by the number of individuals who may be living in a particular home, two-family home, three-family home, the purchase value of that home is inflated. And what that means is that if a developer is trying to acquire that property in order to ensure that it is up to code and rehabilitate it and make it available as affordable housing, they may not be able to absorb the acquisition costs because the current housing is priced at a level out of proportion to what the structure's value is based on its rent rolls. So addressing the issue of code enforcement is a matter of human safety and basic habitability standards, but it is also one that is related to optimizing the overall performance of the housing market and ensuring that properties can be rehabilitated and provided at a range of price points in accordance with our building codes and regulations at the local and state level. And so one of the areas that we've really explored is how to be more proactive with regard to code enforcement. And of course, like every department throughout the country, there's way more violations that can be handled with existing capacity in the building department. And we would like to see that staffing capacity increased as being one method toward increasing the supervision of compliance with the building code. But there's other things that could be done too. And one of them is to better involve the community itself in monitoring the conditions in buildings. Some localities have developed code enforcement committees where residents themselves regularly work with building department staff, and they walk the streets of their neighborhood, and they help the building department to become aware of potential violations of the code. Another thing a building department can do is generate really clear guidance materials about what the code says so that both landlords and tenants understand what regulations are at play, and that information flows out really easily, not just in terms of what the regs say, but also how to resolve a violation. We also think that even though the building department is the place, of course, where you've got your trained inspectors and code enforcement officers, that it's probably prudent for all village staff to at least know something about the codes and how they work. And as we are all doing our day-to-day business in the village, to be cognizant of what those regulations mean and to be able to flag them accordingly. And then finally, taking a sharp look at the current fine structure and asking whether or not it may be possible to increase those fines in order to avoid residual offenses. So these are just a set of possibilities here. And they have the potential here, hopefully, to reduce the number of building violations here. But they also come with a con in the sense that code enforcement is going to require increased costs to the village if it requires more staffing. And I also think that something that many communities struggle with is they want to create a culture where the building code is enforced, and yet it's enforced in a way that is logical, that's rational, and that does not become a basis for harassment and fuel displacement of existing residents. So it's a delicate balance. That's our first strategy. Then,
Can we ask a question before you flip, or do you want to go through the whole thing?
I wonder, because there's so much material, that I should probably get to the end, and then maybe as a note to all trustees, hold your questions to the end, and then let's go in deeper into them. I know that the trustees have been contemplating the viability of reactivating a landlord-tenant council, an entity which is already has been inscribed in the books. And this could be an effective alternative to the building department or the judicial system in terms of providing an alternative means for resolving disputes between landlords and tenants. And also, I think, for distributing information. Just the mere formation of such a council could really help the distribution of information about the code. Just by getting other landlords to know each other, just by getting tenants to know each other. The effectiveness of this council, though, is something that we're not quite sure of, just because so many communities don't have such a council. And I think one thing that my team is really trying to do as we go through all of these strategies is make sure as we put something forward that we can point to concrete successes in other neighborhoods. And we don't quite have yet. Not to say that we won't at the end of this, but we would like to provide the trustees with some clear examples of where the councils have been formed, where they've been effective, and where they've genuinely been successful also in ensuring the full diversity of tenants be part of those councils. Let's talk about the comprehensive plan. So as I mentioned earlier about the fitness of our policy documents in terms of ensuring an adequate supply of housing. Your comprehensive plan does have some good language in it regarding housing and affordable housing, but it is missing some language. For example, it's not clear enough about where are the appropriate places for higher density housing within the village. What targeted areas are most suitable for multifamily development? And it also doesn't address the issue in the zoning code, which I'm going to have to jump to, which is on the next slide, but an issue in the zoning code which allows for multifamily housing to be restricted in certain areas, which allows for even two-family homes to not allowed to be built as of right, even in two-family districts. Now, there was a trend that unfolded in Ossining sometime perhaps in the 80s, I'm not quite sure when, in which Ossining, like now, was responding to the issues of overcrowding by trying to remedy its zoning code by curling back on the allowances as of right for multifamily. And if you think about it, it does make some logical sense, except it creates a situation where in areas in the village that are most suitable for multifamily development, because there already is multifamily development or two-family homes already there, that to do so now would be rendered a non-conforming use and require a property owner or developer to seek a variance in order to build something which is in fact characteristic and consistent with the surrounding area. So meanwhile, while in law, provisions for multifamily or two-family or higher density housing are not permitted, against the law, informally, higher density housing is being provided in contravention of the building code. And so one of the areas of exploration here is to make this system more rational, to enforce the code so that we don't end up with overdensification in places where it's not appropriate, but also to adjust the comprehensive plan so that from a policy perspective, it is clear about the places in which densification should occur, and it is also clear and establishes a legal basis for revising the zoning code so that it does permit multifamily and two-family in places where it's appropriate to do so. And on this next slide, I know that this map is just impossible to read from where anyone is sitting in this room, but I assure you, once it's online and you zero in on it, it really will help you to understand our analysis here, in which we looked specifically at zoning codes in particular areas where we thought adjustments could be made to further and encourage higher densities, whether in the form of allowing them to reflect the existing urban fabric, or being more liberal in allowing accessory units, or also in reducing, for new development, the amount of parking spaces required for multifamily or transit-oriented development, a trend that we've seen in many different other localities that helps to lower the overall costs of construction as well. I believe removing the barriers to development of housing of all kinds through modification of the zoning code is a very important process. It is one that could redress some of the supply questions and affect the nature of affordability for new units. Its con, however, is that the modifications to the zoning code are not going to address the existing affordability challenges of existing housing. And that doesn't mean that it's a fatally flawed proposal. It just means that it's good at doing some things better than it is in doing other things. If there is going to be greater densification in parts of the village of Ossining, one of the primary hesitations that will come up will be the impacts of that densification on parking and the capacity of the road network. Parking and traffic emerge very quickly as concerns alongside overcrowding whenever density is enabled. And this is a tough one, and I'm not going to underplay just the difficulties of doing this. Right now, you have waivers to the restrictions against overnight parking in your residential areas, and those waivers are granted, from my understanding, rather liberally, which creates a situation whereby, let's say in a 2 or 3 family house, overcrowding in a way is actually made possible because of the high number of parking permits that can be granted for any number of tenants in that area. So as a way of rationalizing it, it might make sense here to limit the number of parking permits that would be allowed for a particular dwelling unit. And it also, as I mentioned earlier, with regard to zoning, it also might make sense to reduce the overall amount of parking that as a minimum would be required for new development so that we don't end up with further auto-oriented housing, and we end up with housing, especially in areas that are downtown and near the train station, housing that is more served by pedestrian connections and by transit. This is the third piece, and this is what's hard. Because while you are blessed with a train station, you have only a very limited local bus network, a problem faced by many communities in the Hudson Valley. And what I see here as a major con is that if you reduce the parking that's allowed in certain parts of Ossining, but you don't replace it with upgrades in the mass transit system, you do risk limiting access, especially for those individuals for whom the housing in certain parts of Ossining are the only places where they can afford such housing. Now, modifying a local transit system is not an easy thing, and many communities are frustrated by their inability to get higher frequencies of service and modify routes. But I would argue that in any sort of updates to the comp plan or amendments to the zoning code that follow, that careful attention to parking and transportation policy and coordination with the county and with the transit operator is something that is going to be really important as well. Even if on the surface it doesn't seem like it's a housing issue, how your parking and transportation system establishes just how much density you can bring in. Then, as I mentioned earlier, with regard to the infrastructure that's available for the development of affordable housing, there's a few ways that this could be addressed. One of them might be that the village undertakes within itself, let's forget for a moment about outside entities, but the village itself becomes more proactive about the marketing and redevelopment of sites that are optimal for the type of housing that it would like to see. Now, what often happens is that there's a prime site for development, and maybe it's owned by the village, or maybe it's privately owned, but the village is not working, or the city, or the town, I don't want to pick on Ossining because this is a global phenomenon, doesn't have the resources to be working strategically on the planned redisposition of that site. And so what may end up happening is that a developer comes in and says, have I got a plan for you? And they go forward with a plan to build housing, which might all be luxury housing, or significantly composed of luxury housing, at price points which aren't affordable to current residents. But given the promise of rateables, or at least the way that it's presented, it's really easy to go for it. If you've got within your village administration now a place where you can be truly proactive, and I think a lot about the Market Square sites that are village owned and other places where the village may be able to exercise greater initiative, you might find a better match between the sites that are available for development, the developers that are coming into the village and that are welcomed to develop here, and greater control over the type of housing so that you're truly building housing that responds to the needs of the existing community. To that end, it may also be that something that the village could do is to think carefully about the appropriate way to address tax exemption policy and pilots. And this is something which many communities are beginning to reconsider. Now, for many places, the prospects of a luxury housing development, as I mentioned earlier, are alluring because of its potential to stabilize a distressed area or to generate over the long term a certain amount of tax revenue, bonuses that might seem to warrant a generous award of a tax exemption or a pilot of some nature. But if the housing that's built does not align with the needs of the community, then it may not be appropriate to undertake that type of subsidy. And it might be more appropriate for the village to be thinking about the way in which its tax exemption policy could be aligned with the type of development that is best matching the needs of existing residents. Let's now talk about going outwards a little bit. So we've talked about the village and what they can do. And as I mentioned earlier, we've got a great partner in IFCA doing a lot of great work, not just in Ossining, but in other parts of the Hudson Valley. But something that other communities have also done in order to facilitate the development of housing is to create other types of entities that would also be part of the greater housing development community. And this ranges from across the river, Newburgh's creation of a land bank, or the formation of community development corporations, which perhaps most notably in New York City were active parts of neighborhood stabilization and ensuring a mix of housing that was built and affordable housing as part of neighborhood revitalization strategies. And there certainly are CDCs and other parts of Westchester. There could also be something called HDFCs, Housing Development Finance Corporations, whereby buildings which are rental or vacant properties are redeveloped as tenant-owned cooperative buildings. And this was a strategy that was done most broadly in New York City. You might know it through the term limited equity co-op. And what it entailed was the ability of individuals to buy their apartments, and those subject to restrictions on resale values enabled families to age in place, to not be displaced, to pursue home ownership, another important component of dealing with the overall gentrification issues. Now, not all of these entities are appropriate in all places, and one of the pieces of guidance that I believe that my team really owes this village is careful scrutiny of these entities and articulation of their pros and cons and their appropriateness here, and what might be some of the tools for overcoming the barriers to creating them, and what might be some of the benefits associated with their long-term existence and joining the overall housing development world in Ossining. You have an affordable housing policy in place, and it's got a couple of main prongs, of which one of them is an inclusionary housing policy that requires that for new development, that 10% of the units in buildings with 6 or more units be built so that they are affordable, priced so that they are affordable to households that are making less than 80% AMI. Now, that is a respectable target for inclusionary housing compared to the way that many other communities in Westchester themselves have adopted inclusionary housing. But you have a couple of options here, and one of them is to go broader, that rather than to apply inclusionary housing requirements only to 10%, you could decide to increase it to 20%. And given the income levels in the community, given the cost burden gaps, you also could go for a deeper level of affordability, bringing down the median income required from 80% down to as low as 60%, and thereby creating a wider range of price points that would be available for the new housing year. More recently, another proposal has been put on the table for Ossining, which I find very intriguing, which is a voluntary approach to inclusionary housing for existing units. Traditionally, when we talk about inclusionary housing, it refers only to new housing supply, right? So new housing units come on, and of the new units that come on, a certain percentage of them have to be affordable and to households making a certain income level. Under an alternative proposal, though, landlords could potentially, landlords who already have multifamily units, could elect to apply a certain level of affordability requirement for a portion of their units. And if that were to happen, then that would help to increase the overall pool of the number of units that would be affordable in the village of Ossining. More work, I think, needs to go in toward finding a model where that type of voluntary inclusionary housing has worked, and a better understanding the incentive structure that would be required to do it at a broad enough scale. What's great about inclusionary housing is it makes sure that as new development comes into a community, that there is at least some level of economic integration for the units that are constructed. But what's challenging about inclusionary housing, whether it's done by mandate or whether it's voluntary, or whether it applies only to new units or whether it could be done to welcome existing units, is that it's highly restricted in terms of the scale of affordable housing that it would provide. Even if we go from 10% of housing units to 20% of housing units, the number of housing units that would be termed as affordable would be limited by the amount of new development that happens in Ossining. Now, if you were a community that was ringed by open green fields, ready and waiting for hundreds and hundreds of new multifamily housing units well served by transit, proximate to the downtown, we could look at it and say, wow, a lot of affordable housing would be generated by this. But in a community where developable land is limited and the amount of housing that could realistically be built is checked, the potential of inclusionary housing to deal with the affordability issues in the present for existing residents is limited by the amount of supply of new housing that would be created. Again, that doesn't mean it's fatally flawed. In fact, it's probably something that every community should have at this point, but it does fall short of fully dealing with all of the issues at play. Here's another one. Your current affordable housing policy has a provision that developers who don't want to contribute on site to their 10% requirement of affordable housing, if the law applies to them, that they can alternatively contribute to an affordable housing fund. And that fund will then provide money that another developer could tap into, a developer who wants to build affordable housing on their site and who could use those funds in order to meet the cost of providing that affordable housing. The gap between the amount that housing would cost to be constructed and operated and the amount that affordable housing would actually net in terms of revenue because its price was checked by the inclusionary requirements. What's problematic about the existing policy is that the regulations regarding the actual amount of contributions are not really specified, and it's not really active, and it's not really well understood. So here's a ripe area for the village, if it wants to have a housing fund policy, to make the terms clear about the way in which the contributions need to be priced, and to price those contributions in a way that still incentivizes the construction of affordable housing on site for a new development. But that if a developer opts out and instead decides to contribute to the fund, then let it be that the amount that they contribute is a sufficient level to meet the subsidy requirements for the construction of that unit elsewhere. That's policy option number 10. Finally, let's talk about rent stabilization here, right? Now, rent stabilization is a powerful tool. It's a powerful tool because it can theoretically apply to a large number of units. Rent stabilization can apply to buildings that were constructed prior to 1974 in which there are 6 or more units in a locality that has shown itself to have a vacancy rate of under 5%. And this policy was designed in order to deal with the difficulties of maintaining affordable housing in the context of a highly constricted supply of housing where there is very few units units that are on the market where the vacancy level is very low. Let me be clear about the potential of invoking ETPA here compared to other strategies. As I said to you, the amount of new affordable housing units that could be constructed under inclusionary housing, under the affordable housing policy, and through other measures, is limited to the new supply of housing overall that could be built. But ETPA could potentially apply to as many as 1,200 units of housing currently in existence. And so with that regard, the effect that it would have through price controls set by a guidelines board in Westchester, governed by regulations from New York State Department of Housing and Community Renewal, would ensure that the households who have leases in rent-stabilized units would not experience dramatic increases in their rents on a year-to-year basis. That addresses an affordability issue, but it also addresses a displacement and gentrification issue. Because what it means is that if, for example, there is a proliferation of new luxury housing in a part of Austin, and if that housing has some spillover effects of increasing the cost of housing of properties within its immediate vicinity or throughout the village. And even if there isn't new development, but the housing costs in Austining just continue to soar by virtue of the broader regional trend and the hotness of the New York City market as more people throughout the region attempt to seek affordable housing further away from the city. Rent stabilization allows those households to continue to be part of the community, to not be displaced, to not enter into an increasingly competitive housing market. There's another benefit of ETPA, and that's the provisions that mandate the renewal of the leases on a 1 or 2 year basis for the holders of those leases. And that means that for tenants who might be vulnerable to eviction or harassment from landlords, that they have a mechanism governed by state regulation, overseen by Westchester Rent Guidelines Board, clear, articulate, transparent, of ensuring that their leases would be renewed. And so that provides, again, for a large number of households, a substantive protection against displacement. Those are the most powerful benefits associated with rent stabilization. And I would argue that probably someone can go through each one of them and come up with a weakness associated with those very benefits too. And I want to describe to you some of what those weaknesses are, just as honestly as I conveyed to you what the benefits are of ETPA. Let us start in terms of who ETPA rent stabilization benefits. There really isn't a provision that regulates that rent stabilized units must go to households who are most in need of them, right? Remember when I talked about the AMI requirements for inclusionary housing, whereby affordability is related to someone's income level? While there are at the extremes in the law provisions that allow a unit to be unregulated based upon the rent of the apartment or the income level of the household, the reality is that there's no regulatory infrastructure in place to make rent stabilization a need-based affordable housing program. So that a household that actually may be making a substantive amount of income would still be able to stay within a rent-stabilized apartment. Moreover, because of the succession allowances within the law, they also would be able to bestow that apartment to a subsequent tenant within their immediate family. This creates a tricky situation because it means that the rent stabilization provisions are not just not aligned with affordable housing need in a legal sense, but it also creates a situation where the tenants of a rent-stabilized unit are incentivized to stay, potentially for a very long time, even if the unit no longer meets their needs, which in turn, as critics will argue, has an adverse effect on the supply, because as those units don't move, if you will, in the market, as the market becomes constricted, and only those units that don't fall within that bandwidth of buildings, built before 1974, those are the units that are out there in the rental market, and therefore are vulnerable to very high costs of housing because there's a limited number of housing units in the community that are available. Those are amongst the top cited critiques of rent stabilization. But there are some other ones too. There are also concerns that if a landlord's profitability is checked by rent stabilization price controls, while maintenance costs, as a result of the natural flow of an economy, inflation, and rising construction costs occur, that the capacity of that landlord to meet the maintenance costs required for the ongoing rehabilitation of the building would be compromised, an issue that would run contrary to the code enforcement objectives that we've also talked about earlier. Now, what the literature has to say, professional literature, on the impact of rent stabilization on the maintenance of buildings is a bit unclear. You see it both ways, but it's something to note. Another complication associated with it is the way in which rent-stabilized buildings could potentially affect the tax revenue that the village collects. Because if the profitability of a building over time is reduced as a result of the price controls, and if that reduction in profitability compared to what it would have been had there been no price controls continues, then it's all but certain that the owner of that building will, whether by grievance or simply by the natural process, have a building valued at a lower level than what it would be otherwise, thereby potentially creating a situation where the village may then have to make up the shortfalls for the lost revenue that it would have collected from a building, because the revenue for the rental buildings is driven by their profitability. And then the question is raised, who then absorbs the cost of that gap, especially as we're concerned about the capacity of our residents to age in place, who may have paid off their mortgages, but are still struggling in an income-restricted household economic situation to meet their tax burden, right? So this is another piece of it. Now, in some communities, you might not worry as much about the implications that rent stabilization would have on the valuation of homes and on the tax bill if a relatively small number of units would be subject to rent stabilization. But Austening's in a different category from many communities. And in fact, if it is possible to apply rent stabilization to as many as 1,200 units or somewhere within that family, then the implications that it could have in terms of the impact on the tax revenue could be substantive and something that we'll look at carefully. I don't mean to exaggerate. I don't mean to say that all of a sudden everyone's taxes are going to double. I mean to flag it as a con that merits some close scrutiny. There is a couple other issues. There are the administrative costs associated with shouldering the program, and in all honesty, I know some of the trustees are concerned about it, and I don't have a good answer yet about what in reality are those administrative costs, and we will continue to research it. And then finally, I think that there's an outstanding question here, and a threshold question about how a community qualifies for rent stabilization under the state regulations that require evidence of a 5%, of a below 5% vacancy level. A statistic which multiple people have attempted to determine. However, a statistic which is somewhat elusive because of the ambiguities in the enabling legislation on ETPA and the subsequent guidance, which is less than clear about the appropriate methodology for undertaking such a survey. And so one of the things that my team will be doing is, to the best of our ability, to determine what are the ranges of ways in which the survey can legitimately be done under the DHCR guidance, under the enabling legislation, and what are the implications of those methodological restrictions, as they may or may not have arisen in disputes in courts of law over ETPA, on the ability of the village to embrace the numbers that have been presented before it so far with regard to vacancy. That was a long list of cons. I realize that. And by no means was that my effort to make the argument for why ETPA should not be adopted. At the end of the day, the pros that I identified, especially in terms of the expansive affordability, the protections against displacement, are difficult to replicate through other strategies. Not impossible to hit at, but this is one for which there is a continuum of ways to go on it. And as we continue to probe it, our job is to provide the trustees with the best information we possibly can about the experience that other communities, not New York City, but other communities like Ossining have had in terms of meeting their housing needs through rent stabilization, but by housing needs, I also include within it the importance of fiscal solvency as well. And then finally, our 12th option relates to the promotion of commercial development. And this is something that I think is really important. I know my firm was engaged to look at housing, but housing isn't something that can be analyzed in a vacuum. When we look at the revenue that's collected for commercial development, the very small amount of revenue that the village collects on commercial development, it concerns us about the implications this has on the tax rates applied to owners of residential property. And that with a more diverse tax base, at least some controls could be established on the incremental increases of tax burdens for homeowners. That's one piece of it. But there's another piece here, which is that the problem of affordable housing is really difficult to solve because it's not one in a vacuum specific only to Ossining. The challenges in being able to afford housing is a regional challenge. There are open questions about to what extent every community should shoulder the fair responsibility to redress regional housing needs. And there is a hard reality that no matter how much subsidy we put toward affordable housing, no matter how much we regulate, require affordable housing, the reality is that when income levels are low, when economic mobility options are limited, that a household's capacity to be able to afford the rent is limited. And so I would argue that every single approach to housing affordability in any community also has to look at what the economic development options are, what opportunities are there for creating partnerships with educational institutions, workforce development programs, so that over the long term, especially with your young people, there is a pathway to economic mobility, that the gap between the cost of housing and income is redressed not only through interventions in the housing market, but also in economic empowerment of households to make a greater livelihood as well. That concludes this presentation. And from this point on, as I mentioned earlier, and as Lynn noted at the beginning, our job over the next 4 weeks is to drill down even deeper into these different strategies and to evaluate them in terms of what we think will be their effectiveness in meeting the needs. And with this, I would like to perhaps corral back our trustees onto the table and welcome questions, and our associate Robert Joseph and I are happy to respond to them.
As everybody's getting back to their seat, I'll just thank you very much for, and Robert Joseph, we didn't introduce you. I know you've been working hard with Kevin Dwarka on this project. It's quite an undertaking, and housing is something that the board has put at the top of our list to really proactively understand, and we're really grateful to have this objective outside analysis of where we are, as well as your research on so many other municipalities and what has been successful and then what might be wise for us to consider. I have no doubt that we're going to be moving forward with more than one of these, maybe not all of them, and I guess finding the right mix is what we're going to be working on in the next few weeks. I'll just reiterate to folks, all of this is going to be online, not just in video form to watch the presentation, but we're actually soliciting people's feedback. And Kevin and Robert, you're going to then compile all of that for those of us on the board to really be able to digest it. And then we are going to be, 5 of us and any relevant staff in one way, reflecting it back to you, our further questions, concerns, priorities, observations, to be incorporated into a final report that you're going to be presenting to us next month. Correct?
That's correct. The only thing I would add, Mayor, is that our final report will also reflect a synthesis of everything that we hear from the community so that it's out and open what the debates have been. And one of the things that Robert and I have been doing is going back into the trail, the media trail, the meeting minutes from previous meetings, correspondence that was generated about ETPA, rent stabilization, so that the whole bigger picture in terms of the ongoing input that the village has received will be absorbed within the document.
Thank you. What you did have an opportunity, some of us were able to attend last week, and so we've heard pieces of this presentation anyway, and you've also provided us in advance with information via email, so I imagine that my colleagues on the board have questions and comments.
I had a chance to see the evening presentation last week, and certainly was pleased with all the options that you provided for us. There's a lot to digest here. I'm not going to get into anything specific right now, but I think this is quite comprehensive, and I'm very pleased with the options that you provided for us. And I think a lot of them are very appropriate based on the data you gathered, the interviews you had, and everything else. I guess all I can say is I'm just very pleased. And I think the thing I like about you, Kevin, is that you really try to place an even hand on the discussion by really talking about the pros and cons of every single one, every single recommendation that you make. And I think that it's going to be difficult to sort through this. I know for myself, I was feeling pretty humbled in the back of the room as you went through every single one, and kind of drawing the line down the middle of the page and saying, here's what's good, and here's what's maybe not so good. So I appreciate your even hand and the analysis, and obviously I look forward to the feedback that you get and your synthesis of other information. So thank you very much.
Thanks for not answering my question earlier, because it probably was best, I think, to really go through the dozen issues. I just really more point of clarification. So there was a discussion about punitive, punishment, right? Like you charge people more for bad behavior and reward them for good, etc. So it's the first time I saw the isolate example, an area I'm actually very familiar with. So aside from $1 million, which sounds great in revenues, that tells me that there were a lot of violations, a lot of issues, right? Did it actually, the money's nice, but did it actually solve a problem? Did it actually reduce those sort of problematic overcrowding housing that is in Iceland?
I don't know if it solved the overcrowding problem, but my recollection is that Iceland did see a reduction in the number of violations, especially after about a year's time. They saw that it was working, that there were fewer violations and properties were maintained better as a result.
I mean, I like the escalating fines concept, if you could actually go, but I'm more interested in getting rid of overcrowded housing than revenue source in and of itself. So that's really, I'd like to actually learn more about that. For me, that was a big piece. I want to thank you about looking at parking. Read a lot of studies, in the past year, looking at cities. There are these studies about 11 metro areas in the United States. This is beyond a regional issue. It's an issue at every metropolitan area in the United States, from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles to Chicago. It is, in my opinion, not an Ossining issue. It is New York State and really a big national problem. So I very much appreciate how you encapsulate it for us so that we can look at it. But including the parking, I really want to hear more about that as go through your synthesis, because we talk a lot about parking, but I'm sort of intrigued at the pros and cons of managing parking, what that will get. So thank you for doing that. That's sort of struck me. I never think of it in pros and cons, so I appreciate that. I'm going to look into that a little bit more as you guys go through it. And I just have one sort of more logistical. So you have headers in Spanish, but the document is not. Are you going to do the document in Spanish, or I sort of felt like you were starting, but it wasn't clear what was going on there.
Well, we are looking into the possibility of having the document or sections of it translated into Spanish. And the other thing that is also being explored now is the possibility. We've tried, to be perfectly honest, from the day one, to do is the best outreach we could with the Spanish-speaking community, and to be perfectly honest, with not tremendous success. But one of the ideas, true, that has been out there is to, just as we had those 2 listening sessions last week to go over this presentation, to work with, and we had headsets and translation that was available there, but we may be able to engage, a native Spanish speaker who would actually run the presentation, and that way have, another venue in which people would be able to better understand what the ideas are that are presented here.
Thank you. Just kind of piggybacking what Rika just said in regards to the translation in Spanish. I'm not sure how is that being done, but I think you may want to double check some of that, the meaning of it, because some of that stuff is just not translated properly. That was my comment on a previous flyer as well, but it was too late to revise it and it was already out. And I think it's important if we are going to translate this to any language to be consistent and correct. Grammar is, is needed on this. It seems that we're not making serious questions, I guess, in regards to some of the questions. I do have a lot of questions, but I think I'm not gonna go through all of them, but I do want to mention a couple of them in regards to. I'm a little bit peaked in regards to the building department portion of it, so I like the concept of putting information out there for the public to be informed of the process. Just as a side note, I have done that before, and I think I will keep pushing our building department to do that, which I have taken as a project for myself to give a little bit of that to our building department here. So I think it was kind of interesting to see that as a part of the presentation. So I want to thank you for that. One thing that you did mention on the beginning of your statement was the previous presentation. You gave us a lot of information. You did, and there was a lot critical information that sometimes, as a person, as a community, sometimes we don't want to hear it, even though we may be aware of what's going on. But it's important to see what that is. And what you mentioned then, it was the overcrowding in the percentage of the overcrowded. I didn't see that percentage, because you said it was an estimate, that you didn't want us to hold on to that specific number and what it was in relationship to Westchester County. So you kind of completed that part. Has that number changed? Has it?
No, we're reluctant to essentially publish these numbers and make them public because they're estimates. They're from the American Community Survey's 5-year data, which means that they are a representation of 5 years from 2011 to 2015, and they're an average of incomplete survey data from those years. It's a survey. It's not the census. It does not take stock of the entire village. It's just a survey that has a margin of error, especially in a community like this one, where there is not, where the population isn't very large. The margin of error can be quite high. And while the numbers may be correct, we want to be cautious
Okay.
that we don't disseminate this information.
I understand that. Thank you. The presentation that in regards to the title itself, it was what it was stated was about housing and the stock and safety and everything else. But I like the part that you actually added to the end, the commercial portion of this, which I think is important because that's what I remember when I came to the village many years back. There was a few factories still left from back in the days. So I don't think we're going to ever see that back, but I think something along those lines, which a lot of the communities have been doing. Yonkers has done a lot of that, bring some light industrial, commercial stuff into the communities. Beacon has done the same thing. Wappingers has done some of that as well. So Peekskill has done a lot of that stuff as well. So I think it's important for us to understand that it's not just about housing, and it's just not about bringing people into this, but it's also about bringing jobs that will be, and it will help our community. The last item for me, for now, is schools and how this is going to affect our school system. Because I think even though we don't have anything to do, we're not a school board, but I think we have to be cautious in how we do this for the future of our community itself. We do worry about overcrowding of our housing, but we have to keep that in mind that more housing, that means more kids at some point, and that means more kids going to our school system. So how does that affect? Have you looked at the effect in that?
It's a really good question, and it's a tough one, and there's a couple of dimensions to it. The first one is to what extent would increasing the supply in housing necessarily place an increased demand on the school district, knowing, and I acknowledge, that the rate of increase of the enrollment population in your school district is significant compared to other school districts. On the other hand, much of the housing need that is in Austining is not necessarily translated into housing that generates always large volumes of school children, especially housing that responds to the needs of an older community seeking to age in place, younger people who are looking for housing in downtown areas or near the train station area. So that's one level of it. There's a second level of it too, though, which is I do think that the issues of school capacity are important. But part of the overall quality of the educational experience is also shaped by the quality of housing and habitability too. So regardless, I think it is an aspect that we have to deal with in terms of making sure the kids that are growing up in Austining are growing up under good living conditions too. And that I think is where we're looking at the building conditions as one piece of this as well. And there's a third piece here, which is it possible to be more creative about the ways in which new developers contribute to the costs associated with the school district and the increased enrollment of students and the trend. And we can explore it, but I also want to put a caveat that because of the nature of the school district, well, of school districts themselves, and the ways in which funding allocations are determined and the assumptions that are behind them going way beyond the local level, this is a hard one for us to deal with because it is not entirely within their purview to determine how funding and investment choices are made for the expansion of those school districts. So we're trying, in terms of dealing with the limitations of how we can affect school funding and investment policy, and at the same time, trying to not exaggerate what could be the potential detriment of the increased population associated with new housing, and also aware that new housing, may also serve, or rehabilitated housing may also serve a really important need for your school children. So.
Correct, thank you. And well, that goes back to something that you mentioned as well, which is zoning in our current zoning districts. And to me, it's more like kind of becomes like an urban planning at the end of the day, where you have to look at it as an overall master plan on the whole area to try to minimize the effect in the next 5 to 10 years project. So, but that's something I guess the board will have to look into that and determine what will be the best way to approach this, keeping in mind that it will have an effect, a long-term effect to the school systems as well. So, okay.
Thank you, Kevin. I've had a chance to look at the presentation a few times. So, I'll be contacting you. I think you did a thorough job of giving us 12 options to look at. And I look forward to deliberating with the board and, which way we should go or when we should actually implement it.
All right, thank you very much. I'll just, I want to point out to the public that, as was acknowledged, the feedback will be online for 2 weeks for the public. That's the 2-week time frame for all of us on the board as well, so it's great if people can get on there as soon as possible and get that information out there. So the more that we have early on in this process, then the longer it is that we have to be able to really internalize it and take it in. Although we will have a chance to see all of it, we're going to simultaneously be writing our own comments and questions for Kevin and Jonathan to incorporate. And I'll say after the presentation, one of the public presentations last week, there was a criticism that you were too balanced in your presentation. There were folks, particularly on ETPA, which is an issue that people have really been debating for a number of months here in Austin. There was somebody who was very supportive of ETPA who told me that you had too many criticisms of it, and somebody who was very against ETPA who felt that you were obviously way too supportive of it. So you clearly did an excellent job at making nobody happy who's really dug in. But for those of us who are a little ambivalent, it's very helpful to have a genuine assessment of it. I appreciate that. I'll just reiterate one more time that there were 12 pathways for us to consider, and while ETPA is one that we've been discussing the most and is sort of at the front of people's minds when they think about housing issues. These are really a variety of pathways for us to achieve our goals of safe, affordable, accessible housing in our community. And I appreciate all the work that you've done, and I'm grateful to serve on this board that's willing to delve into it so passionately and so thoughtfully.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, trustees, for having us tonight.
Thank you.